Hi, welcome to Social Coconuts. My name is Andrea, and in this episode, I will be reading a short story by Edgar Allan Poe called The Masque of the Red Death. You have more short stories available by Edgar Allan Poe or other writers. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so deadly or so horrible. Blood was its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and then bleeding at the pores. The red marks upon the body and upon the face of the infected person were the pest ban which shut him out from the help of the other men, and they died within half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When half of his people had died, he called 1,000 friends together, and with them he went to one of his castles. This was a great place, the creation of the prince's own eccentric taste. There was a strong and high wall around it. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers welded the bolts. They left no way to enter or leave, and they had enough food in the abbey. That way, the courtiers thought they could avoid contagion. The world outside could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was madness to be sad or to think. The prince had provided all kinds of amusements. There were clowns, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were inside. Outside was the Red Death. Towards the end of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the Red Death raged most furiously outside, the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball. It was a colorful scene, that masquerade, but first let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. These were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista. The doors between the rooms slide back nearly to the walls on either side, so you can see the whole suite at once. This suite was very different. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that you could see little more than one room at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, to the right and left. In the middle of each wall, a window looked out upon a corridor which followed the windings of the suite. These windows were made of colorful glass. The color of the glass varied in accordance with the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern end was hung, for example, in blue, and blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its decorations, and here the windows were purple. The third was completely green, and so was the glass. The fourth was lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. But the 7th apartment was decorated with black velvet tapestries. They hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling upon a carpet of the same material. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows didn't correspond with the decorations. The glass here was scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in none of the 7 apartments was there any lamp. There was no light coming from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its light through the glass and so lit the room. And thus many fantastic effects were produced. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that fell upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted windows was ghastly in the extreme. It produced such a wild look upon the faces of those who went inside that there were few of the company bold enough to go inside at all. In this apartment there stood a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a heavy clang, and when the hour was to be stricken, there came a sound from the lungs of the clock, clear and loud and deep and musical, but so strange that the musicians of the orchestra had to pause to listen to the sound, and the waltzers stood still for a moment, and there was a short disconcert of the whole happy company, and one could see that the giddiest turned pale, and the more aged passed their hands over their brows as if in dream or in meditation. But when the echoes had ceased, a light laughter arose at once. The musicians looked at each other and smiled and promised each to the other that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion, and then, after another 60 minutes, there came another chiming of the clock, and there were the same disconcert and fear as before. But in spite of these things, it was a happy and magnificent party. The tastes of the Duke were strange. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He had directed the decorations of the 7 chambers of his great fete himself, and his own taste had given character to the masqueraders. Of course they were grotesque. There were much glitter and phantasm. There were strange figures with unsuited limbs. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and nothing that was disgusting. Everywhere in the 7 chambers there walked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these, the dreams, turned around, and the wild music of the orchestra seemed as the echo of their steps. And now there strikes the ebony clock in the hall of the velvet, and then, for a moment, all is still, and all is silent except for the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away, and a light laughter follows. And now, again, the music plays, and the dreams live and dance more happily than ever. But none of the masqueraders goes to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the 7. There flows a red light through the blood-colored windows, and the blackness of the room seems dreadful, and those who step inside hear a sound from the clock of ebony, more emphatic than any which reaches their ears who enjoy the amusement of the other apartments. But these other apartments were full of people, and in them beat the heart of life. And the dance went on until there started the sounding of midnight upon the clock, and then the music stopped, as I have told, and the waltzer stood still, and there was an uneasy halt of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the clock, and thus it happened that there were many in the crowd who had become aware of a masked figure which nobody had noticed before, and once the rumor of this had spread around, there arose from the whole company a murmur of disapprobation and surprise. Then, finally, of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have described, no ordinary appearance could have caused such sensation. But that figure had gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's eccentric taste. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion, even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are both jests. There are things of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now to feel that in the costume of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which hid the face looked like the face of a stiffened corpse, and yet all this might have been endured by the mad dancers around, but the mummer had gone so far as to choose the Red Death. His clothes were dabbed in blood, and his broad forehead was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon this image, which with a slow movement stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he shuddered, either with terror or distaste, but in the next, his face turned red with rage. "Who dares," he asked the courtiers next to him, "who dares to insult us with this horrible mockery? Seize him and unmask him, so we know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." Prince Prospero was standing in the blue chamber as he spoke these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly. The prince was a strong man, and the music had stopped at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where the prince stood, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who was also near at hand, and now with slow steps he approached the prince. But there was nobody who tried to seize him, so he passed within a yard of the prince himself, and while the courtiers shrank from the center of the room to the walls, he walked on, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white and then to the violet, before a movement had been made to arrest him. Then, however, the Prince Prosper, mad with anger and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers. Nobody followed him. A deadly terror had seized upon all. He held his knife and had approached to within 3 or 4 feet of the figure, when the figure who had reached the velvet apartment turned suddenly and confronted the prince. There was a sharp cry, and the knife dropped upon the carpet, and the Prince Prospero fell prostrate in death. Then, with the wild courage of despair, a group of the courtiers threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, gasped in horror. The grave cerements and corpse-like Masque were completely empty, and now they acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one the revelers dropped in the blood-spilled halls of their revel and died, each in the position of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of them, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Go ahead and click on the next story to practice some more.